Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting
Hello.
Scotland. It's Thursday, the 1st of
Hello.
December. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 281 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. Then I will introduce our guest for this evening, and then together we will discuss today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. Ukraine's military has said that Russia has pulled some troops from towns on the opposite bank of the Dnieper River from Kherson city, the first official Ukrainian report of a Russian withdrawal on the main front line in the south. An investigation is underway into a suspected letter bomb sent to the US Embassy in Madrid. It would be the sixth after 5 were sent to the Ukrainian embassy, Spanish politicians, a Spanish airbase, and a company that makes rocket launchers on Wednesday. A private energy company in Ukraine has said that 40% of the country's power infrastructure is damaged as Russian attacks continue to target the supply. As Ukrainians wake up on the first official day of winter, nearly 6 million people across a majority of Ukraine's regions have no electricity, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said. Ukraine dismissed the deputy chief engineer of its Russian-occupied Zaporizhia nuclear power plant on Thursday, accusing him of collaborating with Moscow's forces and treason. The head of the European Council, Charles Michel, has urged China's top leaders to use their influence over Russia to end the war in Ukraine. The US Army awarded a $1.2 billion contract to Raytheon Technologies for six National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Systems, NASAMS, for Ukraine on Wednesday. Russia has claimed the German parliament's move to recognise the 1932-1933 Holodomor famine in Ukraine as a Soviet-imposed genocide was an anti-Russian provocation. Another prisoner of war exchange is taking place between Russia and Ukraine today. 50 prisoners are to be handed over in the latest swap between the two sides. France has become the first major Western state to publicly back the creation of a special tribunal to try senior Russian officials, potentially including Vladimir Putin, for the crime of aggression in Ukraine. Russian forces tried to advance in eastern Ukraine and trained tank, mortar and artillery fire on Kherson in the south, the Ukrainian military have said. Ukraine's foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, has called for the EU to include Russia's missile industry in its next sanctions package. Mr. Kuleba also reiterated Ukraine's need for the US-made Patriot missile defense systems to protect its civilian infrastructure, which is under heavy attack from Russia. And the UK has announced a fresh round of sanctions against 22 Russians, including those, the Foreign Office says, were involved in enlisting criminals to fight in Ukraine. Now, we are lucky enough to be joined this evening by Jackie Kemp. Jackie is a commentator and journalist based between Scotland and the USA. She writes for publications including The Scotsman, The Herald, The Guardian, and HuffPost. In 2012, she compiled an anthology of her father Arnold's writings on Scottish, UK and world affairs, Confusion to Our Enemies, and Jackie has also written the novel London Girl. Jackie, good evening. How are you keeping?
Hello.
Thank you for joining us on broadcast. Thank you for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland this evening. Our first story this evening. It's a pleasure, Jackie. Our first story this evening is that Ian Blackford, the MP for Ross, Skye and Lochaber, has announced today that he will step down as the SNP's Westminster Group leader. In a statement, Mr Blackford said, "I have today informed SNP MPs that I will not be restanding as leader of the Westminster Parliamentary Group at our AGM next week. After more than 5 years in the role, now is the right time for fresh leadership at Westminster as we head towards a general election and the next steps in winning Scotland's independence. During my time as leader, the SNP won a landslide victory in the 2019 general election, with an increased share of the vote, and MPs and support for independence has continued to grow, with polling this week showing a majority in favour. While I am stepping down as Westminster leader, I will continue in my role as the MP for Ross, Skye and Lochaber, and I have also accepted a new role at the centre of the SNP's independence campaign, leading on business engagement. I would like to thank our MPs and staff for all their support over the past 5 years. Whoever replaces me as Westminster leader will have my full support as, together, we stand up for Scotland's interests and democratic right to choose our future in an independence referendum. The First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, said, "I would like to pay tribute to Ian Blackford for his 5 years as leader of the SNP's Westminster Group. He led the group at a time of huge electoral success for the SNP, particularly at the 2019 general election, and has done an outstanding job in holding the Tory government to account and in promoting the case for independence." Last week, it was revealed that the Aberdeen South MP Stephen Flynn was planning to stand for the Westminster Group leader position. The announcement of Mr Blackford's resignation comes in advance of the SNP Westminster Group's AGM, which is next Tuesday. So, Jackie, behind the scenes, some party sources are briefing that it's because of generational issues, gender issues, and the handling of recent sexual harassment allegations. But it may also be the case that SNP Westminster MPs want fresh legs in the battle to turn the next general election into the second independence referendum. So, do you think is now the time for fresh leadership of the SNP group at Westminster?
Definitely. I mean, it's going to be a very tough gig, it must be very hard being in that group. They're very sort of exposed, and there's actually not very much they can really do, is there? Because they're pretty much blocked from creating any kind of legislation, and the Tories have got such a huge majority that they just force through whatever they want. So I guess it must be quite exhausting, and it's really important in the run up to the general election that the group kind of holds together. And there are obviously issues. I mean, there's issues about things like the gender situation. I mean, that one is it's a minefield. The whole gender thing is an absolute minefield. And Ian Blackford's probably had a few fingers blown off with recently. So I think they need to just. It's tough, and I think it is probably 5 years is probably long enough, and good luck to Stephen Flynn. It's a long way to be away from home all week as well. I think he's got a young family, and it's a whole family thing, isn't it? I mean, he must have a supportive family, because it's a really pressurized, intense life. He won't be able to spend a lot of time with his family, and I think just doing it for a few years is probably enough. That all you could ask of someone, really.
That's a very fair point, Jackie. I was thinking, I was struck by how the SNP group of Westminster MPs has grown from election to election. And of course, at one point in the summer, some of the polling for the next general election suggested that the SNP might end up as the official opposition. Arguably, with Sir Keir Starmer leading Labour, the SNP are the de facto opposition. However, putting that to one side, in light of what you were just saying, is managing such a large group of 44 MPs operating in London, is that a significant challenge for whoever is the leader?
Well, I'm thinking about reading Gordon Wilson's autobiography, and his his writing about that, when there was just 11 of them, but there was many more than anybody had expected, and he spent 5 years living in a hotel, and he said it was really difficult. There was drinking, people's marriages were breaking up. There was there's a whole lot of kind of extra pressure that you have to deal with, to do with the fact that you're kind of in this sort of outpost, and you probably feel that you're a long way from home. And it's yeah, he writes about that quite he wrote about it quite powerfully. So I guess I don't know whether people have flats now. I mean, I know that they get paid what most people consider to be a lot of money, but it's not really a lot of money to live in London and to have a house in your constituency. So I guess they're probably it must take a bit of managing.
That's a very good point, Jackie. And it may, as you suggest, it may very well be that there are some lessons from history that we need to consider in the management of the Westminster Group. And just briefly, I mentioned Stephen Flynn, as did you, and after the events of last week, it's considered to be likely that he may put his hat into the ring, so to speak. But more generally, who are you prepared to put your money on, a candidate, or alternatively, who do you think should be leading the SNP at Westminster from next week?
I think whoever leads it should be somebody who nurtures the talents in the group and supports them and helps them to sort of shine, because there are lots of talented people within the group, um, and I'm sure that people like Joanna Cherry. I have a lot of time for Joanna Cherry. I think she's great, and you know, I know she hasn't had the best. She hasn't felt very supported, and and you do have to support people, even if someone's accused of sexual harassment. It doesn't mean you can just hang them out to dry. You have to ask some questions before you kind of throw them to the wolves. So I think whoever does it has to see it probably as primarily a kind of team captain kind of role, trying to keep the team together and trying to maybe even like a team manager, like shouting from the sidelines and seeing who can pass and who can score and just trying to get them to work together.
Thanks, Jackie. That's some great insight. I'm very grateful to you. And for our next item, we'll stay at Westminster because 40 potential breaches of the ministerial code have never been referred to for investigation by the ethics advisor, according to new data. Rishi Sunak has
Mm.
said he is seeking to appoint a new advisor on ministerial interests. However, several potential candidates have already turned down the role. The Prime Minister is not offering candidates any enhanced powers, which means that the advisors would not be able to launch their own investigations. The ethics advisor, if and when appointed, would probably face calls to renew or open at least two complex investigations and conclude one into the alleged Islamophobic comments made by the then Chief Whip, Mark Spencer, to the MP Nusrat Ghani. There will probably also be pressure to open an investigation into the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, who was sacked for a potential security breach by Liz Truss, though, of course, she was reinstated by Rishi Sunak. The pressure group Transparency International has been among those calling for the role to have a significantly enhanced power since it was vacated by Christopher Geit 5 months ago under Boris Johnson. In analysis of media reports, the group found 40 potential breaches of the ministerial code that have not been investigated in the past 5 years. Those examples included meetings by Nadim Zahawi and Kwasi Kwarteng with the Libyan politician Fatih Bashaga, organised by the lobbyist Mark Fulbrook, who then became Liz Truss's Chief of Staff; Michael Gove's acceptance of £120,000 of donations from property developers whilst he was the Housing Secretary for England; and multiple meetings by Anne-Marie Trevelyan with a Chinese state-owned nuclear power company with no record of what was discussed. All the ministers have
Yeah.
claimed that donations and meetings were recorded accurately, but Transparency International said each one represents a potential breach that should be investigated where a perceived conflict of interest may arise. The group has also called for appointments to the role to be made with a competitive process and for the position to be defined in law, rather than both being at the whim of the Prime Minister. So, Jackie, firstly, are you surprised
Yeah, so there
by...
isn't an ethics advisor, is there? And
That's
I
correct.
mean,
That's correct.
you don't have any actual powers to mount an investigation, and without the powers to do anything, you sort of risk just being accused of waving through things that are, oh dear. So you risk kind of being put in a very difficult position. Um, I can't imagine why anybody would take the job. But yeah, certainly I think there should be oversight of things like that. People have meetings with Chinese nuclear power groups, and isn't an official present, and there isn't an official record. That's not acceptable. I think it's just not acceptable.
Although I suppose there are plenty of examples of that. I'm thinking of Priti Patel's meetings in Israel back in the day. But are you surprised by the number of issues that apparently are being left uninvestigated at Westminster?
Well, no, because there isn't an ethics advisor and there hasn't been one for 5 months. So, and some of the things that were done under Johnson were pretty appalling. Like he met with a KGB agent without any officials present just after there was a meeting at the UN about sanctions on Russia. Things like that. It's completely unacceptable. Things like even the way that they're appointing people to the House of Lords, people like Paul Dacre. I mean, he was the guy that was linked with that Enemies of the People headline about the judges. He can't be in the House of Lords. And the car phone guy who's got some dodgy share dealing. There's it's it's really, I think, partly because of the fact that there isn't a written constitution. There's a lot of conventions which are actually quite easy to flout. I think that the state of what's been happening is it's just gone beyond the. It's just they've crossed a line somewhere. In my mind, they crossed a line in the last few years, and I think probably a lot of people feel that. I mean, you can see that from the polling on independence. That I think a lot of people in Scotland are just they're a bit scunnered with it, really. Um, you know,
That
it's just what can we
that's a
do
very good
though?
that's a very good point,
Mm,
Jackie. Thank you. Now then, let's move on to our next item now, because the Scottish Government's consolidated accounts for 2021-22 were published today. The Auditor
yeah, I was just
General for
looking at that.
Scotland The Auditor General for
Yeah.
Scotland reported that the Scottish Government spent £49.2 billion pounds against a budget of £51.2 billion pounds in 21-22, and he called for more transparency around government spending. Their recommendations include fully costing spending commitments and reporting them clearly in budgets, greater transparency over capital borrowing plans and how they apply to projects, more transparency over how reserves are used to help manage cost pressures, and increasing transparency within the accounts around the balances held within the Scotland Reserve. Commenting, the Deputy First Minister John Swinney MSP said, "These accounts demonstrate the careful management undertaken by the Scottish Government in the last financial year to deliver on the requirement for a balanced budget. That prudent financial management took place amidst the continued upheaval of the pandemic, and we allocated significant funding in response during an extremely challenging time for the public sector. I welcome the report from the Auditor General, which recognises the Scottish Government's strength and focus on longer term financial planning." He went on, "We will consider the report's recommendations and have already taken steps in a number of areas, including the due diligence exercises which take place ahead of a Scottish Government intervention to support a company that is at risk." The Scottish Government is committed to producing additional accounts, and the Auditor General's report recognises the steps that we have taken. Progress has been slower than planned as we prioritised work on tackling the current exceptional financial challenges, but I am committed to transparency and have endeavoured to be clear in all my budgetary statements to the Scottish Parliament. I will continue working closely with partners throughout the budget process to maintain that clarity around public spending. So, Jackie, I was struck a little bit by the introduction to the auditor's report. The Auditor General says that in addition to the challenges around COVID-19, the cost of living crisis emerged during the year as a result of higher food and global energy prices, and the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 22 increased prices further and will
Mm.
continue to add pressure on the spending power of the Scottish Government's budget in the years ahead. Now, that's all well and good and seems perfectly sensible, but I wondered whether it was starting to edge into a little bit of political message management. Firstly, there is
Mm.
no mention of Brexit in terms of cost
Yeah, that's
pressures, and,
appalling. That's
and even the
appalling. And if you
ONS
look at
and
the,
the FT,
Mhm.
and even the ONS and the FT is now publishing financial estimates of the negative impact of Brexit.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the FT, the last couple of days they've had a quite a big analysis. Mark Carney, he's not, Mark Carney, internationally respected banker, has said that the UK was 90% of the German economy, now it's 70%, and he puts that down pretty squarely to Brexit. And the pushback on that has been, well, some of that's to do with what has happened to sterling, but sterling fell 10% after the Brexit vote, and it's stayed 10% lower. And so we have imports aren't really, there's no particular barrier to imports. So imports have recovered, but exports are like 24% down. So that gives you a balance of payments deficit, and that's well known to be a cause of inflation. I mean, nobody has export controls and no import controls. It's insane. So, all that's feeding into the damage to the economy. Wages have actually been kept down because inflation's gone up and costs have gone up. So in fact, wages have suffered, instead of rising as you might expect. So Brexit is a huge, huge factor, and it's particularly bad in Scotland, because in Scotland we really, really needed the flexibility that freedom of movement gave, because young people would come over from Europe in the summer, live in a caravan, work in a big hotel, and then they'd go back. And there isn't either, we don't control immigration, but there isn't housing and there isn't work for those people over the winter. We have one of the oldest populations in the world. It's not realistic to think people in their 50s are going to start picking fruit. So it's just is terrible. The Brexit is an absolute burach. And I think the fact that the Auditor General didn't acknowledge that is ridiculous, really.
Thanks, Jackie. A burrock amongst burrocks. I think you're absolutely right. But let's look at the UK economy from a slightly different perspective now, because more than 7 million people who no longer qualify for energy support from next spring face years in fuel poverty if average heat and light bills remain at £3,000, and that's according to a report that's calling for more targeted help. In his November budget, the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt announced that the government's energy price guarantee would rise from April to £3,000 a year for the typical home, and the £400 help paid to all households this winter, regardless of income, would not be repeated. The report from the Social Market Foundation, in conjunction with the fellow think tank Public First and the Citizens' Advice, questioned whether that stance is sustainable, given the millions of people it will leave struggling to pay their energy bills. While Mr Hunt said those on benefits, pensions and in vulnerable groups would continue to be helped after next April, his budget offered no support to those who are on lower incomes who are earning just above the benefits threshold. The authors of the report found that 12 million households face crisis-level energy costs with bills at their current levels. 3/4 of them receive welfare benefits or the state pension, meaning that they qualify for additional government energy support. However, that leaves 3 million households containing 7.2 million people who face paying more than 10% of their income simply on gas and electricity, and thereby they are living in fuel poverty. So, Jackie, as I was saying, there are 3 million households containing 7.2 million people who face paying 10% of their income on gas and electricity. They're in fuel poverty. Now, two things struck me. I think it's more than likely that the amount of people's incomes in the poorest or the least well-off homes in Scotland will be paying more than 10% for their gas and electricity or their heating, especially if they are off the grid because they live in rural parts of Scotland, and also the weather is bluntly more harsh in Scotland.
Yeah, yeah.
And secondly, is even and so how can we address the situation that they find themselves in? And secondly, is even 10% of people's income, is that even sustainable?
Well, yeah. So I want to address those points, but first of all, can I just reel back for a tiny minute to say something about the budget? Because I was reading the Scottish Government's budget, and just in case people think that they were left with a big chunk of money, is things shifted during the year, like what they thought the student loans were going to cost and what they actually cost was different. But they can't just take that money because it belongs in the student loan budget. They can't take it into current spending anyway. I just wanted to say that anybody can read the accounts, and I thought they were quite clear. But anyway, just to go back to the energy thing, yes,
Yes.
I wish if Scotland were independent, it would have a bit more. It would be able to manage things a little differently. Scotland does pay more. We pay more in standing charges. A lot of Scottish people in the Highlands don't have access to gas to heat their houses, and it's much more expensive to heat them by electricity. Also, every household in the UK, we're being charged for a nuclear levy where we don't need nuclear power. We haven't got pumped storage hydro. the Scottish government's put planning permission in place, but they can't create contracts for difference. And there's just innumerable issues that Scotland's such an energy-rich country, and yet we're not seeing the benefit of that. British electricity bills are the highest in the world. We're also being charged for the cost of companies that went bust thanks to Ofgem's crazy lack of regulation. They encouraged a lot of cowboys to come into the market to buy and sell electricity. And I think the Scottish government actually did really well to sidestep that. They got a feasibility study which said don't touch it, and they didn't. They would have gone bust. Their energy company would have gone bust if it had gotten involved. So a lot of companies went bust, and the cost of bailing them out is being taken from people's bills. That's another reason why they're so high. I mean, it's just appalling. But what do we do going forward? I mean, I think managing how we use electricity is going to be really important. So I was just reading about this. Like we hear a lot about demand side reforms, but supply side reforms have got the potential to be really huge. Like in California last summer, when they had outages and an air condition crisis, they sent text messages out to people saying not to put on power hungry appliances at certain times of day, and that helped to kind of manage demand. And I was reading in the FT about a company based in Scotland called Flexitricity, which is kind of working on these smart grid supply side reforms. So everybody needs a smart meter in order to be able to participate. And things like probably need to give people bigger incentives not to do their washing at a certain time of day, or tell them when they should do their washing, and then we can sort of even out demand a little bit so that we don't have to pull on gas powered fuel stations, or those surges. That's one reason that we build up a lot of cost. It's like suddenly there's a gap in supply and we have to turn on stuff that's really expensive. So if we can sort of think about managing the supply side so we don't have to do that so much, that'll help. That's one thing that'll help.
That's a very good point, Jackie. I know, in terms of demand side, the smart meter last night told me just how much it cost me to make a lasagna last night, and I'm not doing that again until the price of
How
energy
much was
comes
it?
down.
How
Two
much was it?
pounds, two
Just for the
pounds to bake
cooking?
just to bake a lasagna. I was horrified. So it's off the
Wow,
menu from now on.
that's interesting,
But
isn't it? I mean, there's other things like air fryers are a bit more energy
yes,
efficient. I mean, or cooking for the week and then freezing it, and you know, people are finding ways to reduce their costs. I mean, I noticed that in the States, there's a big rise in multi-generational families moving in together. Like, I wonder if
yes.
that's happening here too. I bet it is, because it's just one way of reducing costs, isn't it? If you're making a lasagna for four people instead of
Precisely,
one.
precisely. That I'm sure that this is a story that we're going to come back to and discuss again, Jackie, both in terms of the cost of energy and also in terms of our diets. But we'd better move on now. But we're
Yeah.
going to continue to look at the cost of living crisis, because new research revealed that Brexit has piled on more than £200 to average household food bills, affecting poorer households the most. The Centre for Economic Performance at the London School of Economics found in its analysis that around £6 billion was added to UK food bills in the 2 years to the end of 2021 due to increased customs checks and requirements on goods, translating to an average of £210 per household. The report stated that leaving the EU increased the price of food products by 3% a year, leading to a 6% increase over a 2-year period. Richard Davis, a professor at the University of Bristol and co-author of the research, said, "In leaving the EU, the UK swapped a deep trade relationship with few impediments to trade for one where a wide range of checks, forms and steps are required before goods can cross the border." Commenting, the SNP's international trade spokesperson, Drew Hendry MP, said, "This damning new research highlights once again that Brexit doesn't work. Many households are already struggling to make ends meet, and these latest findings that Brexit has piled on more than £200 to the average household food bill will be hard to stomach." He continued, "With entirely avoidable increases in customs checks leading to higher costs and bills, Brexit continues to be an unmitigated disaster. Households are left picking up the bill for the devastating cost of Brexit, while both Labour and the Tories ignore the impact and continue to be joined at the hip in backing Brexit, no matter the price. So, firstly, Jackie, does this research suggest that Jacob Rees-Mogg was mistaken, or was he lying when he told us in 2016 that voting for Brexit would mean that the cost of food would come down?
Yeah, I think he was lying. I mean, he was probably thinking about his own like hedge fund. Cost of food would come down for him because he'd make so much more money. I've just been reading Butler to the World, which is one of my favorite books of 2022, and it's quite eye-opening how much um, wealth there is in the UK because of the fact that there are really very little checks and balances on the kind of money laundering, dark money that sloshing around in this country. So yeah, we got with Brexit. I mean, we got used to something like 40% of our fruit. I don't know, a big percent of our vegetables came from Europe, of course, and we got used to having that access to those cheap, um, cheap fresh produce. And it's people were like, oh well, we can just grow it in Britain, but you actually can't because it's quite labor intensive, and we don't have the people, and they have two crops in a lot of Europe. They kind of
Mm,
have they just create a lot of they can create a lot of fresh produce. But also the other thing is about CAP. The Common Agricultural Policy was really designed to take away some of the cost of food away from the person who buys it from the consumer and put it on the taxpayer. And that's really the whole point of CAP, is to keep the farmers in business and to make sure that it's cheap at the point of sale. It's not cheap to produce because when you're paying for it, you're only paying a small part of what it costs to produce actually. But unfortunately, what's happening in Britain is that there's no real replacement for that. Like the kind of subsidies that farmers used to get, I think they're kind of quite unclear as to what they will get, and obviously what Scotland can do is dependent on the Barnett consequentials. So it's like they're not. So what the UK gives Scotland, it's not even dependent on what Scotland needs or what Scotland says it wants. It's the consequentials of a policy that's designed for a different country. So who knows what the British government is going to give farmers? But I think they believe that it's the people who are buying the food who should pay the whole cost of producing it. So
yeah.
that's what's happening. And I remember saying to people when I saw this starting to happen a couple of years ago, that food is going to get more expensive because of this. But people are like, oh it won't, or people won't notice. But actually, that is what's happening, and people are
Yeah.
noticing.
Absolutely, Jackie. Thank you. Let's move on to our next item now, because since the Republic of Ireland joined the European Union, it has unleashed its immense potential, and that's according to the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen. Addressing both houses of the Irish Parliament, the European leader told how Ireland's GDP per capita was half the EU average when it joined and is now double the average. By stark contrast, the UK is the only G7 nation to have shrunk by 0.4% since Brexit, with the EU growing by nearly 3%. Commenting, the SNP MSP Gillian Martin said, Ireland's performance as an independent European nation outlines why Scotland needs to escape the chaos of Westminster and become an independent country and rejoin the European Union. Ursula von der Leyen has outlined the prosperous future that Scotland would be able to take advantage of as part of the European Union, a market 7 times the size of the UK. The UK's economy is in a downward spiral, turbocharged by Brexit, and Scotland is being dragged along for the ride, with Brexit and the Tory-made cost of living crisis piling misery on the people of Scotland and businesses across the country. She continued, while Scotland is being held back by the UK, other independent countries of the same size as Scotland are thriving. They are happier, wealthier, and have lower poverty levels compared to the UK. So, Jackie, firstly, as a to set the backdrop to this story, joining the EU and opening up markets to the EU underpinned the financial performance of the UK in the Thatcher era
Mm,
as well. So it had positive benefits
yeah.
both for the UK and Ireland, didn't it?
Well, actually, Britain and Ireland joined on the same day, didn't they? Like it was the 1st of January 1973 or something. And
Hmm.
yeah, it did help. And also, I think it kind of created a bigger world. Ireland has been really successful at having young Irish people training to go and work in the EU. You sort of meet Irish. Whenever I'm in Europe, I often go to an Irish bar. There's always Irish bars, always young Irish people. They have that opportunity to go and live and work in Ireland. They also have the opportunity for people to come back to Ireland. But yeah, so I think Britain was always used to being able to bully Ireland, but now Ireland's got a big friend on its side and who's actually stuck up for it and said, no, you can't bully us anymore. Um, so it's really interesting what's happening in Ireland. And I think that I was just reading about the Northern Ireland Protocol. So the situation with the Northern Ireland Protocol is quite obviously quite difficult, and they're trying to get the DUP to compromise, which is never an easy thing to do. So if the DUP were prepared to compromise on some of their issues about the Northern Ireland Protocol, which it actually is good for Ireland because the Irish economy is now growing, the Northern Irish economy is now growing faster than any region of the UK other than London. If the DUP could sort of compromise on some of that, then they can have another power sharing agreement in Stormont. But if they don't compromise on that, which seems kind of likely, then I think the next stage might be direct rule from London and Dublin for Northern Ireland. Imagine the two governments could work together to kind of run Northern Ireland in a way that Sinn Féin might find acceptable, and the DUP have kind of given notice that they don't find anything pretty much acceptable, and they voted for Brexit cynically because they saw it as giving the possibility of having a border on the island of Ireland. That's probably why they were into Brexit, and they voted for it, and it hasn't worked out the way they planned, because the border's in the Irish Sea.
Yes.
But I saw a survey
Thanks.
recently.
Yeah,
Sorry,
go
just
on.
one more point. I saw a survey recently, and it's about people asking people whether they think the UK as it is will still exist in 5, 10, and 20 years. And most people think it won't exist in 10 years, but the highest number were like 89% of people in Northern Ireland think it won't exist as it is in 20 years. So I think even the unionist community in Ireland sort of see that they are moving towards a united Ireland, and so I think that's something that we should acknowledge and try to manage.
Absolutely, Jackie. I was very struck by the speech that Ursula von der Leyen made in Dublin today. One element of it, I was also, and you've touched on the Northern Ireland Protocol. One other element I was going to talk to you about was I think the EU Commission President was reflecting on the social change that we have seen in the south of Ireland. She said that when she was a teenager, she remembered that at that time married Irish women were still banned from working in the public sector. She went on to quote the former Irish president, Mary Robinson, who said, Irish women went from rocking the cradle to rocking the system. Do you think Ursula von der Leyen's correct?
Well, yes. I mean, obviously there were, if you look at, it was really awful the way that women were treated. A lot of women were treated with the kind of the Magdalene laundries and stuff. No, it's terrible. It's terrible. So Ireland didn't go into independence and have immediately things kind of get better. But then, the history of Ireland is pretty grim, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot of really grim stuff if you think about the famine and all the emigration, and yeah, Ireland has had a bit of a tough time in many ways, and it's great to see it sort of flourishing the way it is at the moment.
Thanks, Jackie. We'll move across the Atlantic now because a US House of Representatives committee has now obtained access to Donald Trump's tax returns, following a years-long court fight with the ex-president, who accused the Democratic-led panel of being politically motivated. Treasury has complied with last week's court decision, a Treasury Department spokesperson said in an emailed statement late yesterday. The Supreme Court ordered the release of 6 years of returns last Tuesday, rejecting Trump's plea to stop the Treasury from acting. On Wednesday, the release of the tax returns was first reported by CNN. According to the network, which cited an unnamed aide to the Democratic Committee chair, Richard Neal, Democrats on the panel were due to be briefed today on the legal ramifications on the sections of the tax law that Neal had used to request Trump's tax returns, but would not immediately see the returns. The committee has been seeking the tax returns spanning 2015 to 2020, which it says it needs to establish whether the Internal Revenue Service is properly auditing presidential returns and whether new legislation is needed. The House Ways and Means Committee first requested Trump's returns in 2019. A major question hanging over the panel now is what will happen to the returns when Republicans take control of the House in January. Democrats held their Senate majority in the midterm elections in November. It had long been customary, though not required, for major party candidates to release their tax returns. But Trump was the first major party presidential candidate in 4 decades not to refuse release his tax returns, as he sought to keep secret the details of his wealth and the activities of his real estate company, the Trump Organization. Financial and taxation practices at the company are now under scrutiny in criminal and civil cases in New York. Attorneys are presenting their closing arguments in the criminal tax fraud case today. So, Jackie, as I say, the practices at the Trump Organization are being scrutinized in a number of criminal and civil cases in New York, and we're expecting to hear the closing arguments in the criminal tax fraud case today. So, do you think is there any chance that the various legal challenges that the former president faces, will combine and will become too much for Trump to handle, or is another run at the presidency his only hope of fending off what some might say were the inevitable catastrophic collapse for a few more years?
I think the Republican movement is kind of gradually moving away from Trump, and I don't think he might stand for the nomination, but I don't think he'll be the presidential candidate. I think they're going to go with maybe Rick DeSantis or potentially Mike Pence, but probably DeSantis. So I think for some reason Trump is ratings catnip. So we only ever hear about American politics when it involves Trump. There's suddenly it's all over the news because people love to hate him. He's this pantomime villain, and that's. I mean, I think we should sort of ignore him, a bit more. I mean, obviously you can't ignore stuff like that. That's really important. I mean, the other story that was in the papers at the weekend was that he had a sort of anti-Semite whose name I've forgotten, like a real, like really kind of hardcore anti-Semite round for dinner at Mar-a-Lago, and yeah, he's gone. He's sort of jumped the shark. I think he jumped the shark a while ago. Really.
I think that's a very fair assessment, Jackie. And yes, as you were mentioning, the widespread press reporting on the weekend that Trump had been dining with Nick Fuentes, who is a notorious anti-Semite and right-wing agitator. Let's move on, however, and let's come back to Scotland, because Scotland's attractiveness to global investors will be enhanced by the establishment of the First Minister's Investor Panel. The expert panel of investors and asset managers will advise on how Scotland can create the right conditions to attract global capital investment to develop the physical infrastructure required for a just transition. Its remit includes areas such as offshore wind, hydrogen, and the decarbonisation of transport. Members have been selected for their experience and expertise, bringing together a wealth of knowledge to provide market intelligence in current and future green investment opportunities. The First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, and Angus MacPherson, the Chief Executive at Noble & Co., will co-chair the panel, which will meet for the first time on the 12th of December. Speaking at the City UK Annual Conference in Edinburgh, the First Minister said, "Securing capital investment from sources within Scotland, across the UK, and right around the world is fundamental to enabling us to achieve our wider ambitions for the economy. Tackling the climate crisis is both a moral obligation and an economic opportunity. We have the chance to establish Scotland as a major centre for green and ethical finance, while helping Scotland, and perhaps the wider world, to move to net zero." So, Jackie, the First Minister highlighted that tackling the climate crisis is both a moral obligation and an economic opportunity, is that the key for it? That highlighting investment opportunities, highlighting opportunities for a return on investment comes first, and worrying about the moral imperative to protect the planet seems to come second.
Well, I think you know, you need to make things actually happen in the world. It's tough. You know, there's huge potential in terms of people thinking up clever stuff like you can store energy by melting salt, or hydrogen. I was talking to someone about hydrogen the other day, and it's so dangerous. The only thing hydrogen wants to do is combine with oxygen, and when it goes on fire, you can't even see it. You can't see the fire, and it seeps out of pipes. You can't have it in normal pipes. So it's like everyone's like, oh yeah, it's going to be great. We're going to have hydrogen to heat our houses, but I mean, it's terrifying if you think about how insanely dangerous it is. So it's not to do with like it's a moral imperative or oh it's now it's business. You need these people to actually turn brilliant ideas into commercial, usable, sustainable um, businesses that really work, and that's hard stuff. So all the expertise is valuable, and you know, it's Aberdeen. There was a report by Robert Gordon saying that if Aberdeen is going to really fulfill its potential and become a renewables hub, it needs huge investment, like 18 billion, like billions of investment. It's not forthcoming from the UK government. They're just giving it peanuts. So we're falling at the moment. The risk is because we have a lot of fine words, but we don't really have the potential to borrow the money. And then engaging with global capital is hard as well, because we had that before with Timex factory, all these things. People come for the grants, and then the risk is that they're going to go away again. So it's all tough stuff, and I think it's great to be getting advice and engaging with people about what the challenges are, what the opportunities are, and how Scotland can but make the most of what we have here. And just obviously everybody's pushing for the green transition. Um, but things like the supply chain issues mean that actually we're producing fewer offshore wind turbines in the UK than we were, because the cost of them is going up because it's harder to get the bits that you need. Tough. It's all tough.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Jackie. Thank you. Now, we'll stay in Scotland for two pieces of health news. Firstly, thousands more people living with long COVID will find it easier to get help as the Scottish Government boosts funding for an advice line. Chest, Heart and Stroke Scotland has been awarded £157,000 to continue offering expert advice on how to manage long COVID symptoms such as fatigue and breathlessness. The charity will recruit extra staff to ensure more people can speak to a trained nurse who can offer practical support for anyone struggling with the long-term effects of COVID. The Health Secretary Hamza Yousaf said, "I recognise how debilitating long COVID is for many people across Scotland. It is therefore vital that people can get help to manage their symptoms and know when to escalate and to see a doctor." Chest, Heart and Stroke Scotland Service is helping people with long COVID across Scotland from the comfort of their own homes, helping support them sooner and easing the pressure on the NHS over the winter months. So, Jackie, the Chest, Heart and Stroke Scotland's interim chief executive, Alan Cowie, said there are 180,000 people living with long COVID in Scotland today.
Yeah.
So with such a large number, do you think, are we doing enough quickly enough to help these people?
I actually know a couple of people that have got COVID effects, and they are sort of managing them. I guess it's like any kind of chronic condition. You sort of have to manage it. I don't suppose. I mean, there more research is needed. I don't suppose they really can do that much. I mean, the people that I know, I don't think there is any particular. What can they do? They don't know what to do about it really. So
That's a
really
very good
unclear.
point, Jackie. That it's pretty clear that medical research into long COVID is still at a very early stage, and that the very wide range of symptoms that people display if we're suffering from long COVID is presenting challenges for medical research as well. It's clear that there's a great deal that needs to be done in order to address the challenges that people suffering from long COVID are facing. But we've got
Yeah.
two health stories from Scotland this evening, and the second one is that people at risk of contracting HIV will find it easier to get pills to prevent infection, as the world's first online clinic is set to be developed next year. The pilot could make it possible for participants to order medication to prevent HIV from the comfort of their own homes. Pre-exposure prophylaxis, or PrEP, the tablets used to prevent HIV, has saved thousands of lives across the world since it was introduced to Scotland in 2017. Scotland was one of the first countries in the world to introduce this service, which offers free preventative medication to those deemed at highest risk of acquiring HIV. The online clinic, which the Scottish Government has allocated £200,000 to develop, will mean people can test at home and manage their medication without needing to attend a specialist clinic, freeing up more time for complex cases and easing pressure on the SNHS. Over 6,500 people have had PrEP prescribed at least once, and there has been significant reduction in new diagnoses of HIV amongst gay and bisexual men in the 4 years since it was launched. The move forms part of the Scottish Government's HIV transmission elimination proposal, which sets a clear path to stop the spread by 2030. A marketing campaign will also be launched over the coming months to raise awareness and to reduce stigma surrounding HIV and AIDS. The Public Health Minister, Marie Todd MSP, said, "Today, on World AIDS Day, we are taking another bold step to stop the spread of HIV in Scotland. 40 years ago, an HIV diagnosis was a death sentence. Today, people with the virus are able to live long, happy and healthy lives thanks to effective treatment." So, Jackie, the Scottish Government has committed to a proposal which aims to end new transmission of HIV in Scotland by 2030. That'll be 50 years since we first began to identify its transmission. Is a 50-year gap, is that good enough?
Well, it's great, isn't it? I mean, I think it's actually turned out a lot better than it might have done. I remember, when AIDS first started happening, people didn't think that there. I mean, probably a lot of people wouldn't have believed that we would kind of get to the stage that we're at. So that's really great. Science has delivered huge developments, and it's good. That's good news. So it's nice to have a bit of good news, and good news about COVID as well. Really, that it's retreated. There were times at the beginning of the pandemic when I would have been pretty relieved to hear that we're all opened up again now, and that um, the death rate, although terrible, it could have been worse, right? So,
Absolutely, Jackie. And with regard to PrEP in particular, and reflecting on the way in which the Scotland's NHS operates, meaning that medication is free at the point of delivery, there are no prescription charges in Scotland. Do you think that wider understanding and education regarding, for example, PrEP, and also easier prescription and management, do you think is that being given enough priority, both amongst public health practitioners and also in our wider communities? Do people know about the availability of PrEP sufficiently yet? And if not, what can we do to make it a much more commonly understood process and approach to preventing the transmission of HIV?
well, I mean, I'm sure that. I mean, I imagine that the people who I don't know, there are people who are working in this field who know much more about it than I do, and they seem to be doing a pretty good job. So you know, those are successes, and I think things which help to ease the pressure on A&E and on the emergency services are are definitely positive. So and I guess that's one of those. So yeah, I mean, I don't know enough about that, but it sounds to me like they're doing a pretty good job.
It does, Jackie, and it struck me as interesting as well. If there are a number of initiatives to promote what are called pharmacy-led initiatives to do the same thing that you were just talking about, that's to provide health care and health advice through community pharmacies, meaning that pressure on
Yeah,
GPs and pressure on A&E are is reduced, and so this I think is perhaps just
yeah,
one example of how pharmacies and pharmacy-led interventions may improve the quality, the availability and quality of
yeah,
care, and also reduce pressure on A&E and on our GP practices.
yeah, and that's also transformed over recent years. I remember walking around a shopping centre with my son, and he swallowed a Holomint or peppermint or something, and it bruised his throat, and he was like complaining and complaining. I took him into Boots, and I asked to see the pharmacist, and I think the woman who came over, I don't think she was a pharmacist, because she said, "Oh, you should take him to A&E. It might have went into his lung." And I was like, "If it went into his lung, he wouldn't be walking around whinging." But that was what she said. So it didn't really help me to calm my son down. But anyway, I think if you go into pharmacists now, they often have a consultation room, and they can do loads. So that's really, really good. I read a really interesting piece in the Herald by Helen McCardle, and she was comparing Ninewells with Forth Valley, and just explaining why Ninewells has much lower waiting times than other hospitals at A&E, and they never have an ambulance pile up outside, and that's because, one, they have this really strict policy, which everybody in the area knows, that if you go to A&E with a sore toe, and you've had a sore toe for 5 days, they'll just say you shouldn't be here. Go to the pharmacist or go to your doctor. But they don't let people come in who aren't in an emergency situation. And then also they push people out of A&E, and they end up waiting outside the wards, because they push them out of A&E as soon as they're stable, and they say, like, this isn't our job now, we're emergency. So the plus of that is that they have this high throughput of the ambulances, and the
Yes.
negative is that once someone's stable, they might be on a trolley waiting outside, I don't know, chronic surgery, chronic, geriatric ward or whatever. So yeah, it's really interesting just comparing how different hospitals handle some of the pressures on A&E, and I think we need to just give a bit more thought about that. I think people go to their doctor a lot more now. I think the NHS is
Mm.
based on a sort of average of 3 contacts per year, and now it's 7. People just expect a lot more of their doctors than they used to.
That's a very good point, Jackie, and something that also I'm sure that you and I will discuss on Broadcasting Scotland again in the future. However, I'm sorry to say that that is all that we have time for this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs, and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to develop the station, and to make new programmes for you. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 per month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new supporters to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. To everyone who has donated, and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment as a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras or in any other way, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot. Please like and retweet us there, and you can find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland and to click on the little bell on that platform. Now, we will be back tomorrow evening at 7 with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please come back and join us then. I'd like to thank everyone who's been watching this evening, and I'd like to say a very special thanks to our very special guest, Jackie Kemp. Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you.
I hope that you have discovered something nice in your Advent calendar today, and that you have a very peaceful evening. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.